feminist community of practice, and this is session 1, which is really looking at feminism itself as a theory and as a practice and as a social movement. And this next section, there's actually I think about 4 slides, and we're going to go through those slides together, and then we get to the next section, which is also a recorded section. So remember, some of this work will be online for those of us who aren't able to be in this community of practice. We've got 73 participants, which is so wonderful, across 10 Pacific, small island, large ocean states and territories. But we really want to also share these resources with everyone. This next set, and you can see the slide here, is about the fact that, you know, where we are in the world matters. And we've really kind of talked about that before, that if you look at kind of her stories and histories of feminism, one of the things that we know is that feminism has been around all the way through millennia, right? It's just that we wouldn't have called it that. We would have called it something else. There have been individual and collective sets of women who have, through the ages, resisted the idea that they have to only be a certain way or only do a certain kind of work. So context matters when we explain which women, which gender non-binary people, which people are the ones, which men as well, who are the ones who, at the local and at the global, whether we are in what we call the majority South, the main part of the world where all the population of the world is it those people who are getting a chance to speak and to act on certain issues they care about? Or is it those who have been part of past imperial and colonialist powers that have really, for a small amount of people on the planet, they have too much power? So which sets are we talking about? And then in Dawn, they had a really beautiful set of feminist work that was about saying, it's not just about the North and the South, right? Or the rich and the poor, or the developed and the developing. These are all words, organizing frames that we use throughout the world. But also it's about what we call shifting poles of accumulation. So one of the interesting things that we have to think about is, where are those small pockets of wealth that are within the majority South, for instance? It might be, for instance, in a country that has oil. But who within that small island country, for instance, say Timor-Leste, does everybody have access to that power that comes from the natural gas or the oil or the fracking or whatever it is? Or does everyone in that society have access to that wealth? And the same thing for the pockets of poverty within what we call the global North. So you might be living in America, but we all know, right? America is far from this dream of equality for everyone. So who are those who don't experience the same power and economic and ecological health and well-being because maybe of their color or some other part of their identity? So we're trying to look at shifting poles of accumulation as well, not just global North is this, global South is this. So then the next part of this kind of framing is to say, another way to complicate it is to say, we talk about nation states all the time, right? But one of the interesting things that feminists and others say is, be careful also, because the way we talk about nation states is as if they've always been there and they've always been the same and they are the only way to organize society. And one of the things we know is that's not true. There are so many different ways to organize as human beings around this planet, right? And one of the things we say is that we talk about nations as people who share a common ancestry, right? So we might say, these people from this nation. And then we talk about a state in a slightly different way. We say, okay, the state of Fiji is, what is it now? 51 years old, right? 1970. We became, and we say, independent, right? So you have to, as a feminist, go independent from what? And that's a whole story of coloniality. And a state is a political community. It is about power, and it's governed by certain laws, right? So a nation state is what? These two things coming together. The idea of a people who share a common ancestry and a political community. But we all know as humans that that's not just neat little package that comes together with a bow. That's why we have so many problems around the world, because what we're doing is negotiating this idea of what is an individual, what is a collective and a community, what is a nation, and what is a state. And I think as feminists, we've been one of the sets of people in the world who've been helping each other to make sense of this. Because if we don't make sense of it, there are lots of people who will take advantage and who will politicize it for their own means. And it can be for many, many different means, whether it's someone wants power or whether it's someone wants wealth or whatever it is that their particular kind of, what they're trying to make in the world, right? So as these nation states became into existence, they've started to have more or less power. So let's look at the United Nations, for instance, right? One of the things I always say is, we work a lot in the United Nations, but let's think about the origins of the United Nations as well. That's an institution, right? 194 nation states in the UN, all sorts of different nation states, everyone from Russia to China to India, right through to Tuvalu, to Chuuk, to Fiji, to the Caribbean. And then you have all kinds of highly politicized states like Palestine, many others who only have observer status, they don't have full state status. And then you have the difference between all of those countries who sit in the UN General Assembly and then just those countries that sit in the Security Council. Now, everybody's supposed to have the same voting rights, right? But there's a certain set of countries who were involved in the making of the UN after World War II, who really have a veto on many of the decisions within the United Nations. So why am I talking to you about that? It's because, just let's remember as feminists that when we walk into any institution, we are walking in there with these lenses on, that we are always being critical. That critical, not in the sense of I just criticize, but critical in the sense of who's this body? What does this institution have in its history? How will I engage with the people in that institution? Because if we have those lenses in place, then we go in better informed, then we can go in with social movements and other organizations, then we can work out with who's in our governments that we can work with. And I think we just saw that at COP26 that was happening in Glasgow. Hey? That's a climate change example. But there are many, many ways that we can find to work with and around and through the major institutions in the world, including how we work with our governments or work around and over and through them, and also how we work in the United Nations. That's just two examples, but there are many others, like how we work with churches, how we work with educational institutions, all these academic institutions, all those are really important. The next one I just wanted to show was in terms of the map. Anytime you look at a map, it's political, right? As feminists say, the personal is political and the political is always personal. So when we look at the Pacific, even the idea of who we are as Pacific feminists is a political question, because who are we within this set of 22 island states and territories? If you're on this call, there's 74 people on this call, and if a majority are from Fiji, then you have more power in the room than those who are not from Fiji, right? And we often find that there might be one or two from certain countries, and then there's more from the rest of the Pacific. So we also have to check our own selves and go, what is our geopolitical power? What is our organizing strengths? How do we help each other if we're talking about power within social movements? It's the same thing as this intersectional issue is the same kind of issue as we talk about if there's a majority of people in the room who are cis, straight, or heteronormative people, then those of us who are lesbian, bisexual, transgender, the rest of it, will also have to have an idea of our own power in that room and how we negotiate. If you are younger in the room, if you are older in the room, if you don't speak English as well as somebody else in the room, but that's the main language, if you are someone who is relying on sign language and interpretation, are you sure that you are getting the full value from this and also from the community of practice? So it's all of our responsibility to map in many different ways, to think about power as we map. And I put the 3 big red arrows in there for a specific reason, because This is the ones who often are the economic north in the economic south, and they have a big set of power within our region. And sometimes we don't talk about that because they are often also the donors. They are often also the ones who bring a lot of movement power in terms of our governments. They work with and between and around the Pacific Islands governments. So Australia, New Zealand, but I also put an arrow around Indonesia because of the issues that are happening around West Papua right now, and the fight for liberation that is going on in West Papua. So all of these geopolitical realities, feminists are always extremely interested in. They are the basis of our work, which is not pretending that everybody here has the same amount of convening power, but there are real differences in the way we move through the world, not just as individuals, but how we move as societies, as groups of people, and as gendered bodies within these different contexts. So if we want to talk about North and South, we can also talk about it in terms of Pacific as well, in terms of Australia and New Zealand and their convening power within the region. Yep. So this was the slide that I was talking about earlier when we look at climate change. Yes, no plastic straws is important. Yes, turning off your air conditioning is important. Yes, recycling is important. But really, our attention should be on the problems of capitalism and the problems of fossil fuel and the problems of all of the damage that's being caused by land grabs that are associated with coal and oil and fuel and all those other issues that are to do with an economy that is really based on fossil fuel. So if we put our attention on the edges, on the reform, then we're not getting to the really transformative change that we require, which we have to get to really fast now. 1.5 to stay alive, right, has been the leadership call of the Pacific. If we always say as a chant, you save the Pacific, you save the world. That's not just a chant. That's about if we don't get to 1.5, doesn't matter what we're doing, many of us as countries in the Pacific won't be there in 2050, 2100. So if that's the truth of it, then we need to be very clear in our focus as social movements, including the feminist movement here in the Pacific. Yeah. So I just wanted to not spend too much time because I want, in the next 15 months, my kind of idea, and I hope you agree, and I'd be interested to hear from you, have you done any written recordings of kind of gender justice movements in your country, in your region? Have you done any of that work? Because we have a little here in Fiji. There's a couple of small booklets. There's a couple of people who've written about it, and we'll share some of those resources. But really, if you look back through her stories and histories, what you'll see is from Rome, there's been women who have walked out of the nation state, for instance, at a particular time. 14th century Europe, there's been the Girmicha women who had strikes, and we don't even talk about some of those wonderful sets of work, but Roshika Deo and many others, Sharon Bagwan Rolls, there are women who have been starting to put together those sets of stories again. What are all those resistance movements of all different genders? The anti-slave movements in the US have been there from the beginnings, right? Right from the beginnings. And they've got a bigger tradition now of writing back, what we call writing back, writing ourselves back into the histories. Because often those histories are written by those who supposedly won, or those who are in charge. There have been Iceland mass women's strikes. There are PNG women who've been beaten up. And I just gave an example here of where work a few years ago, who were beaten up by local policemen. And then Vanuatu women who marched on parliament, and they sat in front of the doors and they refused to move until a certain law on changing the penal code on Ivor laws was changed. There's also the early work of Songasonga Vakmarama Itoke, which is from 1924. They were called the Ruve movement, then they became SSV, and now they do a lot of work both in the both with other feminist organizations and also with Diva for Equality and many other groups. So across movements, whether it's Indigenous women's movements, Indo-Fijians women's movements here in the Pacific, or many others across the region. Then there's also lots of feminist groups that have come since USP days. If you look at the early days of University of the South Pacific, there was a really strong set of work into the 1970s, from when it opened in, I think it was 1968, and how that developed over time. But I just wanted to say, one of the sets of stories that we've forgotten is often those individual women who have done work. And what would be great over the 15 months is to really collate and collect and write about some of those women. One of them, for instance, is Lani's mother, Taufa Vakatale, and all of her early work on education. But so many women's stories across Fiji that maybe we haven't included in our nation's stories. And then the work of groups like FemLink Pacific and Diva for Equality and House of Chameleon have joined those older sets of organizing. Shamima Ali and the work of Fiji Women's Crisis Center, Fiji Women's Rights Movement, but also even further back, if you look at the work of the YWCA, Amelia Roketuivuna, man, my brain, 53-year-old brain, and many other groups that are here across the, and really, can we, maybe in the chat, if we can start to share some of those foundational women and those organizing sets of people, whatever gender, who've been working consistently on gender equality and universal human rights for decades. And the last one is every Pacific country has those stories, but one of the things that we can say consistently is that there hasn't been a critical mass of men who are taking part in solidarity action. There are pockets. There is a network of male champions who are now in Papua New Guinea. There are also a network here in Fiji that is based around the work of Fiji Women's Crisis Center, but those sets of work are still just emergent in the Pacific. There are very strong networks of men's feminist groups in Latin America and in many countries in the economic north, but those we haven't got to yet here in the Pacific. And that's the work of men to do that. But it is also the work of all feminists to kind of think through how some of those opportunities can be created. And I wanted to just say one of the sets of maybe the way we can change the way we look at feminism in the region is don't just look at those who are the ones who are seen in the public eye, or who are the lawyers, or who are the doctors, the so-called professionals, because those are the leaders in a certain area. They are the institutional leadership. But there are many, many others who've been in resistance in many, many other forms. So one, Dr. Yoko from USP has done a set of work around women's organizing around rugby here in Fiji. And she talks about that as a grassroots form of opposition to, you know, to certain hegemonic gender structures. If you take on rugby as a career, then you are already putting yourself in the public eye. And if you have, for instance, a sexual orientation or a gender identity that's a little bit outside the mainstream, then you can get even more violence or discrimination or stigma. So all of those sets of work are also work of resistance and of liberation and bodily autonomy, as we talked about earlier.